So good evening and a warm welcome to all of you as we present the 11th Annual George Washington Book Prize. And I must say, my personal favorite event of the year, because we almost always have a night like this. And I was reminding some people that just a couple of years ago, at this exact stage in the evening, an eagle flew at the top of these columns from one side of the piazza to the other, and people said, "It's the soul of George Washington." You couldn't have done that. Steven Spielberg couldn't have pulled that off. So I am Barbara Lucas, the 21st Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and as always, it's a real pleasure to be here, not only to announce the winner of this very prestigious award, but also to celebrate the enduring connection between Washington College, Mount Vernon, and the father of our country, George Washington. Traditionally, we make this important announcement of the winner of the prize at the start of the evening. So without further ado, and so that you can breathe easier through dinner, we will introduce all four of this year's finalists with the help of students from Washington College, who will display the covers of these extraordinary books. So to introduce this year's four finalists, I am joined by the president of Mount Vernon, Kurt Vibrants, who must be Kurt, Dr. James Basker, Jim Basker, the longtime president of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, Dr. Adam Goodhart, director of the C.V. Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience at Washington College. You know who you are. And our own Dr. Doug Bradburn, the founding director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington. Ta-da. Kurt, would you be so kind as to lead the way?
Good evening and welcome. It's my great pleasure to introduce the first of this evening's finalists for the Washington Book Prize, An Empire on the Edge, How Britain Came to Fight America, by Nicholas Bunker. The book was published in September 2014 by Knopf. Shortly after the book was named a finalist for our book prize, it was also named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. So it's always gratifying to us here when the Pulitzer Committee chooses to follow our lead. And we just want to say thank you to our jury for their prescience, and we want to congratulate Nick Bunker for these accolades. In many respects, Nick Bunker's book is an excellent companion piece to last year's winner, The Men Who Lost America, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire, by Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy. Having now read these two books, I'm still looking for a sympathetic treatment of Lord North, and I'm hoping at some moment I'll see that. An Empire on the Edge explores the 3 years leading up to the American Revolution, with particular emphasis on the Boston Tea Party, as a tangible example of Britain's many miscalculations in trying to shackle the colonies with economic bonds to help pay for debts incurred during the 7 years or French and Indian War. We Americans do well to study the war for independence from the British perspective, as it always provides valuable insight to the origins of the conflict. While focusing on the period from 1772 to 1775, Bunker himself writes, "The war had been long in the making, the product of an empire and a system deeply flawed, the work of ignorance and prejudice and of men well-meaning, but the prisoners of ideas that were obsolete and empty. You cannot force a form of government upon a people." The Duke of Richmond had said in the House of Commons, but although the radical Duke would be proved right, it would take long years of fighting before the nation could admit that this was so. So by Bunker's account, the colonists were by the very definition of unruly. Not submissive, ungovernable, and from those incorrigible beginnings rose our great republic. Nick Bunker's book is eminently readable, covers new territory in its study of the geographic, economic, social, and political forces that led to the revolution.
The second finalist for the 2015 George Washington Book Prize is A Tale of Two Plantations, Slave Life and Labor in Jamaica and Virginia, by the distinguished historian Richard S. Dunn, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Dunn's monumental study of Caribbean and American slave life is the crowning achievement of a scholarly career that stretches back more than 50 years. to his first book, Puritans and Yankees, The Winthrop Dynasty of New England, published in 1962, and his path-breaking study, Sugar and Slaves, The Rise of the Planter Class in the English West Indies, which appeared in 1972 and established him as one of the most widely read and influential figures in the burgeoning field of Anglo-American slavery studies over the past half-century. Many other books and scholarly editions followed. But A Tale of Two Plantations took, by itself, 40 years to complete. A method that Professor Dunn Riley notes in his introduction, quote, is not a recommended modus operandi for historians. But the result is an astonishing book that, drawing on two massive archives, one in England, the Barham family papers about the Mesopotamia estate in Jamaica, the other here in America about the tale of his family's Mount Airy plantation in Virginia and later acquisitions in Alabama, presents a richly detailed, sensitive, and illuminating depiction of slave life that may never be surpassed. His book brings back into view the lives and experiences of some 2,000 black men and women who might otherwise have remained in obscurity, while also revealing some of the stark differences between the slave systems in the British Caribbean and America. For all its demographic detail and long sweep of history, the book is also quite moving. The jury concluded their report by saying that Professor Dunn's Tale of Two Plantations is an uncompromising look at the untold damage that slavery inflicted on its victims, but it is also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
I feel like I should pause for a minute in case that eagle shows up. I didn't bring my eagle whistle, but here's hoping. The third nominee is When the United States Spoke French, 5 Refugees Who Shaped a Nation by Francois Furstenberg. One afternoon in October 1794, two of France's most blue-blooded aristocrats, the Prince Bishop, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord, and the Marquise Henriette Lucie de la Tour du Pin, met on a backwoods farm in the upper Hudson Valley. Both had fled from the French Revolution's, shall we say, guillotine moment for the safety of the United States, with the now penniless Marquise making ends meet as a house cleaner, seamstress, and farmer. And when Prince Talleyrand arrived for a surprise visit at the farm, he found her in the front yard with an axe in one hand and a freshly severed sheep's leg in the other, apparently making preparations for dinner. Never one at a loss for words, always the polished French courtier, Talleyrand made the best of things by quickly paying her a courtly compliment. No one could handle mutton with greater majesty. Encounters, incongruities, and transatlantic twists of fate are at the heart of this lively and sophisticated book. When the United States Spoke French chronicles a little-remembered moment when tens of thousands of Francophone refugees, including some of the brightest political, social, and intellectual lights of Ancien Regime Paris, washed up temporarily on American shores. But Francois Furstenberg's account is far more than just a collection of memorable portraits, although it does have those. Rather, he tells a story of unintended consequences, of revolutionary ripples that became great waves as they crossed and recrossed the ocean. Not just lords and ladies, but goods and capital, words and ideas shaped the future of both the old world and the new. Now, the French arrivals were often greeted with, shall we say, ambivalence, including, indeed, here at Mount Vernon, where one expat, a notoriously radical count who visited here in 1796, kept demanding a letter of introduction from the president to smooth his path as he continued his peripatetic travels through America. And he finally got one, or so the story goes, that read in its entirety, Count Volney needs no recommendation. Signed, George Washington. Now, Francois Furstenberg's book got a far warmer endorsement from the George Washington Book Prize jury, which called it an exemplary model of collective biography.
Eric Nelson, The Royalist Revolution, Monarchy, and the American Founding. Generations of students have been taught that the American Revolution was a revolt against royal tyranny. And they're still being taught that here at Mount Vernon as well. In this bold revision, and we love boldness here at Mount Vernon, Eric Nelson argues that a great many of our founding fathers saw themselves as rebels against the British Parliament, not the Crown. The Royalist Revolution interprets the Patriot Campaign of the 1770s as an insurrection in favor of royal power, driven by the conviction that the Lords and Commons had usurped the just prerogatives of the monarch. Please come help us, the Americans begged their king. Your parliament has run amok. Now, Nelson argues that when it came time to design the state and federal constitutions, the very same figures who had defended an expansive conception of royal authority in that run-up to the American Revolution, people like John Adams, people like Alexander Hamilton and James Wilson of Pennsylvania, Supreme Court justices, and their allies, returned to the fray as champions of a single executive vested with sweeping prerogatives. As a result of their labors, the Constitution of 1787 would assign its new president far more power than any British monarch had wielded for almost 100 years at the time the Constitution was put into place. On one side of the Atlantic, Nelson concludes there would be kings without monarchy. On the other, monarchy without kings. The jury considered this work, as I think we all do, bold and engaging, explaining complex political ideas in lucid prose. If you look at the last 25, 30 years of historiography of the American Revolution, it's obsessed with the ideas, the ideologies, the constitutions, the character of the revolution itself. And to make the mark that Eric Nelson has made is an extraordinary achievement in a book about ideas. By shedding new light on a long neglected stream of revolutionary political ideas, his book opens a whole new chapter in our country's ongoing debate over the meaning and significance of the American Revolution.
See, where else could you get a nice history lesson on a pretty night like this with a drink in your hand? And that's why I love this event. So in endeavoring to be bold, as Doug said we are here at Mount Vernon, may I have the envelope? Where's the... He's marching boldly toward me. So thank you. And is Dr. Mr. Griswold, President Griswold, interim President Griswold here? You can share in this announcement. Thank you. Boldly tearing it open. So the winner of the 2015 George Washington Book Prize is Nick Bunker for An Empire on the Edge. Nick, would you come up? You give him that? Mm-hmm. Very nice. We'll hear more of you. You're welcome to say a remark or two, but we will hear more from Nick this evening about his book, and I'm sure you'll all enjoy that. Would you like to thank your mother, your children?
Well, thank you. It is indeed an honour to receive the George Washington Prize, and a pleasure to do so on such a super southern evening on George Washington's own doorstep, so to speak. Now, I'd like to begin with a few words of thanks and congratulation to Barbara and her colleagues, fellow members of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, our hosts for this evening. I think it would be very hard to find a more conscientious body of trustees, or indeed one more elegant. In fact, I served myself as a museum trustee for a number of years in England, so I can to some extent understand the difficulties that are involved and also the great rewards that are involved. The museum in my case was the Freud Museum, which was the house of Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, and I had the honour of being the chairman of the board for several years. And the reason I mention that is because it means that I come here to Mount Vernon today after an absence of more than 30 years. My last visit was in 1982. I come here and I look at the estate with a semi-professional eye. And I think what one sees here is really quite remarkable, what has been achieved under the watchful eye of the association and of the directors, Kurt Vibrants and his predecessor. Not only house and grounds in absolutely peak physical condition, beautifully looked after by staff who seem extremely friendly and helpful, but also, of course, a vast array of activities and interpretation and programs and new buildings, particularly wonderful new buildings, which mean that under Kurt's orchestration, not only is the estate preserving the legacy of George Washington, but it's also recreating and to some extent reinventing it for the 21st century. So I think they really do deserve our thanks and congratulations. And there are a number of other people who deserve my thanks too. Of course, I would like to thank the judging panel and the sponsors, CV Star, the CV Star Centre, Gilda Lehrman, and the Fred Smith National Library. And so, of course, I'd like to mention Adam and Douglas and Jim. I'm delighted that Jim's involved because, of course, he's a Columbia faculty member and I was a Columbia person myself. My book, An Empire in the Age, and its predecessor, Making Haste from Babylon, would never have seen the light of day without my editor, Alfred A. Knopf, Carol Janeway, who unfortunately can't be with us this evening. Carol is a multi-talented, multilingual person, and she saw the potential of these two books immediately, and as I say, I'm immensely grateful to her, as also to my editors in London at the Bodley Head, Will Sulkin and Stuart Williams. Bodley Head and Knopf both being part of Random House. The last two people I need to mention are the most important. First, my agent in London, Bill Hamilton. Bill is a superb literary agent. He's probably the best literary agent in the UK, and I owe an immense amount to him for supporting me in my various endeavours. And then I come to my wife, Sue, who again is still in England. She has all kinds of things to do at the moment in her career as an interior designer. But Sue has been a tower of strength for me for the last 30 years or so in our course of our married life, and has been extremely long-suffering as she takes into account my rather bipolar approach to writing. Let me finally conclude by mentioning my fellow prize winners, Francis Furstenberg, my fellow finalists rather, Francis Furstenberg, Eric Nelson, and of course the indefatigable Richard Dunn. Now Richard Dunn's work I do know extremely well because of course he is the great go-to person on subjects of slavery which do play a significant part in the background to my book, even though they're not dealt with very explicitly. And in particular, I think he and I have something in common, which was we have both spent an awful lot of time in archives in the UK, both the National Archives at Kew and the Bodleian Library. And all I can say is this, that when you go to the National Archives at Kew, you will always find that the first scholars on the doorstep in the morning are the Americans, and they're always the ones who have to be persuaded and coaxed into leaving in the evening by the staff. And I just wrap up with one final comment. I'd also like to thank two other creatures. George Washington had many virtues, but in my opinion, one of his greatest virtues was his lifelong love of the canine species. And all the dogs who lived here at Mount Vernon, I think it was Madame Moose, Vulcan the food thief, Sweetlips, Mopsy, a whole bunch of them. Well, I'd like to thank my dogs too. I have two dogs, I do. Champion Tekelgarth Quintus and his great nephew Tekelgarth Mercury. They are otter hounds. They are very shaggy and very large, and they are immensely helpful to me to have them curled up at my feet, rather sprawled across the floor when I'm wrestling with knotty problems of historical interpretation. So thank you, Bill Hamilton. Thank you, my wife Sue. Thank you, Mercury. Thank you, Quintus. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Two dogs at my feet would just make me sneeze, but I'm glad that they are your muse. But that was lovely, and I was just thinking that it's nice to show off Mount Vernon distinguished people from the mother country. We had the Prince of Wales here not too long ago, and the Duchess of Cornwall, and it was a lovely day here, and so they seemed to have a good time too. So now we move on to dinner, so I'd like to invite you to follow the fifes and drums, and they'll lead us down the North Lane to the Orientation Center. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Togo West, former Secretary of Veterans Affairs and past Chairman of the Mount Vernon Advisory Committee, who will be giving tonight's invocation.
Thank you, Madam Regent. Remaining seated. Seated. Let us pray. Gracious Lord, thank you for this day which you have made and for this evening and its events, which have been supported by our sponsors. Thank you for the life and example of George Washington, founding father, first president, first and foremost citizen of his country. Thank you for the stewardship, the leadership of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, for the work of its intrepid staff and president, and for the joyful support from those who tender their time, their talents, and their treasure to move this great effort forward. Thank you especially for those who write and research and record and talk and converse about this nation's history in their volumes, in their pages, and about the circumstances of this nation's progress. Especially thank you for those who have been nominees and for the winner of the George Washington Book Prize of 2015. Pour upon them and upon this assemblage, we ask your blessing, your continuing guidance, your inspiration. And as Memorial Day approaches, we ask that you hold in your protective embrace those who, in uniform and in other ways, defend this nation, serving as each of us would live in the tradition of General George Washington, bravely, with integrity, with faithfulness, and with a firm belief in the greatness of this nation and in the enduring nobility of all her people. Amen.
Thank you, that was lovely. Before we go any further, I would like to take a little bit of time here to extend special thanks to the extraordinary catering firm of Design Cuisine, who has underwritten tonight's dinner very, very generously. Those of you who have been with us at other major events here at Mount Vernon will recognize the signature flair of design cuisine. They do everything beautifully from the table settings to the exquisite food and flawless service. They've been Mount Vernon's official partner for many years, and we couldn't be happier about that. So now let me recognize a few people who have joined us for this wonderful event. And if you don't mind standing quickly when I call your name, I think people would enjoy seeing who you are and where you are. So I'll begin with Gail Barry West, the wife of the Honorable Togo West and Mount Vernon's Vice Regent for the District of Columbia. Gail. Alan Griffith. Alan Griffith is a member of Mount Vernon's Advisory Committee, and he's here with his wife Penny. Alan is over there. The Honorable Samuel Alito, Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and his wife Martha Ann at our table. Neighbors of Mount Vernon and frequent guests. Sheila Coates, President of Black Women United for Action and a new member of the Virginia Governor's Board of Visitors for Mount Vernon. Sheila. Ms. Jeannie Belisles, founder and chairman of the Virginia Literacy Foundation and the former First Lady of Virginia. Is this echoing? Is this, okay, it sounds funny to me. Jo Carol Porter, chair of Mount Vernon's Lifeguard Society, and her husband, Jim. Jo Carol's doing a great job for us. Ann Horner, board member for Washington College, here, thank you. Mr. John Gray, director of the National Museum of American History. Thank you. The Honorable Trevor Potter, the former chairman of the Federal Election Commission. Nice to see you. Mr. Edwin Grosvenor, President of the American Heritage Society. Mr. Robert Wilson, Editor-in-Chief of the American Scholar. Jim Grossman, Executive Director of the American Historical Association. And I want to recognize two longtime personal friends of mine, Truman Siemens and Clinton Daly from Brown Advisory in Baltimore, have been so helpful to us on some viewshed issues. Stand up, my friends. Thank you. In tonight's set, and I should mention Jackie Mars is here too, and the Mars family has been so wonderful to us over the years. So thank you, Jackie. Always nice to see you. In tonight's setting, it seems particularly fitting to mention our new research fellows at the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington. This residential program is attracting both distinguished academics and authors and rising stars in historical research. Through this program, we intend to cultivate and inspire the next generation of scholars to focus in new and interesting ways on Washington and the founding era. We're fortunate to have the following fellows here with us tonight. Dr. Kate Elizabeth Brown, recipient of the James C. Reese Fellowship on the Leadership of George Washington. Is Kate here? Okay. Dr. Brendan Gillis, recipient of the Society of the Colonial Wars Fellowship. Nice to have you. Dr. Bruce Ragsdale, recipient of the James C. Reese Entrepreneurship Fellowship, that's funded by the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation, and Dr. Dana John Stefanelli. And of course, I'd like to thank Doug Bradburn for so ably leading the library and turning it into one of the foremost international centers for education, not only on all things Washington, but it's become an epicenter already for scholarship on the colonial and founding eras. So, with that, with that, I invite you to enjoy your first course, and then we'll have further remarks later in the evening. Thank you.
Right. Good evening, and Barbara and Kurt, thank you for providing this lovely venue. It's fabulous. My name is Jay Griswold, the interim president of Washington College, a very puny stand-in for Sheila Bair, who seriously, who couldn't be here tonight. Otherwise, she would have been here because she's the real president of Washington College. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Mount Vernon, the home of our college's founding donor, 50 guineas he gave Washington College, patron and namesake. It has been my honor to serve as interim president for the past year at the Revolutionary College named for George Washington. For over a decade, we have gathered here at Mount Vernon to award the George Washington Book Prize and recognize the year's best books on the nation's founding era. I believe Washington himself would have been equally delighted to have hosted this evening during his lifetime at his beloved Mount Vernon. A bit of a bibliophile, he had an extensive and very personal library with over 1,000 books on subjects as diverse as military history, agriculture, and religion. I think all of us would agree with Washington when he wrote, quote, "A knowledge of books is the basis upon which other knowledge is built," unquote. It is this knowledge, this love of books that we celebrate tonight. And throughout the academic year, we delight in sharing a love of books and knowledge with our students at our college. We are pleased that 6 of our student, quote, knowledge seekers, unquote, have joined us tonight. Will the Washington College students and recent graduates please stand so we can recognize your achievements? Another group of people I would like to recognize are the wise men and women, the current and emeritus members of our Board of Visitors and Governors who follow in the footsteps of George Washington, who also served on the college's Board of Visitors and Governors. Would you all please stand? And our chairman, Larry Culp, I see over there. The George Washington Book Prize is a working collaboration among 3 great institutions: Washington College, George Washington's Mount Vernon, and the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History. We salute Mount Vernon's Commander-in-Chief, Kurt Rebrandt, and Barbara Lucas, she's from Maryland, who do so much to make this evening an elegant and memorable one. We bow to the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, its distinguished president, Jim Basker, and especially its founders, Richard Gilder and Louis Lehrman. It is their generosity that makes the Washington Prize possible. The C.V. Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience at Washington College administers the Washington Prize. They collect dozens of the best books published each year that focus on America's founding era. A jury of 3 eminent historians review those books. This year's committee included Rosemary Zakari, Philip Morgan, and Ted Widmer. We are delighted that jury members, Rosemary Zakari and Ted Widmer, are able to join us tonight. Perhaps they would stand up to be recognized. This is not in my script, but I believe it's correct that Ted Widmer, who was the first director of the Stevie Starr Center, this all originally was his idea, that Jim Reese and Jim Basker really picked up on, and look what you guys have created. It's fabulous. And also thanks to John Roberts at CV Star, had a small part in it. I now invite you to join me in recognizing the 3 finalists for the 2015 George Washington Book Prize. You heard about their wonderful books earlier this evening, but we now have a gift, a specially selected rare book on Washington and his times, and a framed citation to bestow on each of them. Our first finalist is Francois Furstenberg. Furstenberg's collected biography, When the United States Spoke French. 5 Refugees Who Shaped a Nation explores how former French revolutionaries, emigres to Philadelphia, influenced the growth of the new American Republic. Furstenberg is an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. His first book, In the Name of the Father, Washington's Legacy, Slavery and the Making of a Nation, was a finalist for the 2007 George Washington Book Prize. Congratulations to Francois Furstenberg for When the United States Spoke French. Dr. Furstenberg, would you please come forward to accept the gift? And you can come from Hopkins and visit Washington College anytime you want. Our next finalist is Richard Dunn, A Tale of Two Plantations, Slave Life and Labor in Jamaica and Virginia. Tackles one of the American Revolution's most challenging issues, human bondage in an age of liberty. Dunn is the Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Professor Emeritus of American History at the University of Pennsylvania. Among his many publications is Sugar and Slaves. Congratulations to Richard Dunn for A Tale of Two Plantations. Dr. Dunn, would you please come forward?
Thank you, sir.
And our next finalist is Eric Nelson. In his book, The Royalist Revolution, Monarchy and the American Founding, Eric Nelson turns upside down the conventional image of the war as a rebellion against a tyrannical king. Nelson is Robert M. Barron Professor of Government at Harvard University and the author of 2 previous publications. Congratulations to Eric Nelson for the Royalist Revolution, and Dr. Nelson, would you please come forward? Now, I'm told all 4 of our authors have kindly agreed to make themselves available after dinner to sign copies of their books. We hope you'll enjoy reading these outstanding works of American history, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight and for honoring 4 exceptional historians, teachers, and authors. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, sorry to interrupt your conversation, although there's a lot of historical energy in the room. My name is Jim Basker, and I'm president of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, and it's in that capacity I'm here tonight. We are proud partners with Washington College and Mount Vernon in sponsoring the George Washington Book Prize. which with a cash award of $50,000 is one of the largest history book prizes in the world. I want to thank especially some of the individuals you have seen this evening already. Jay Griswold, the interim president, who has done the hard work of serving on the board from time to time, and Adam Goodhart, who's director of the Starr Center, and the prize administrator, Gene Wertman, and here at Mount Vernon, of course, the regent, Barbara Lucas, and all of her vice regents, Kurt Vibrants, and all the staff who do such a marvelous job. It is a magical experience to be here, and it's done so beautifully and graciously by the people at Mount Vernon. It's easy to forget how much hard work goes into it, so we want to thank you all. It's a partnership which we enjoy. We love working with these people, and we hope it will continue many years into the future. Before presenting the prize itself, I want to say a word about the Gilder Lehrman Institute, partly because I've run into a handful of people who say, now tell me what you do. The Gilder Lehrman Institute was founded by the philanthropists Richard Gilder and Louis Lehrman in New York. And the founding endowment was not money. We don't have much endowment, but a collection. They built a collection of American historical manuscripts, more than 65,000 valuable manuscripts, which was the largest in private hands in the world. And then they did something unusual with it. It includes hundreds of George Washington manuscripts and thousands of founding era documents. But instead of donating it to their college or showing it to their friends at cocktail parties, they created the Gilder Lehrman Institute as a 501c3 devoted to K-12 history education, and asked us to use that document collection as our radiant energy. Indeed, here in Mount Vernon, in the museum, there is a Gilder Lehrman gallery where documents from the Gilder Lehrman collection are on rotational display. You can find your way under the sheet metal one day, you'll see the museum and those documents. Based in New York, we are nonetheless really a national organization. We have programs in all 50 states, including traveling exhibitions that visit 130 sites or more in 35 states each year. Each summer, we sponsor 40 teacher seminars with leading historians, including often one here at Mount Vernon, for 1,000 teachers drawn from all over the country and indeed from 10 or 12 other countries. We sponsor an online master's degree program in history for teachers who can do it online, but with great professors like Ed Ayers and Alan Gelzo and so many others you'd recognize. And we currently have more than 500 teachers enrolled as master's degree candidates. We sponsor essay competitions for thousands of school kids across the country, including a Dear George Washington competition for fourth graders, where they write a letter to George Washington as the newly elected president, advising him on what his first priorities should be. We have a network of 7,000 affiliate schools in all 50 states, which includes more than 30 schools in the District of Columbia and more than 120 in the state of Virginia. And we have a website that's increasingly important to us as the vehicle for disseminating documents, videos of historians, curricular materials, and so forth. And the teacher and student visitorship to that website is now approaching 8 million visits a year. One of our most distinguished affiliate schools is represented here tonight, over in this part of the room, the School Without Walls in Washington, D.C., which is a blue ribbon public school that sends 97% of its graduates to college, and I'm told tonight that it has been ranked as the 72nd best school in the United States. And so representing them here are three important people: the principal, Richard Trogish, the assistant principal, Sylvia Isaac, and our star teacher at the school, Carlton Ackerman, who was the 2010 District of Columbia's History Teacher of the Year. Would the three of you stand, please? While I'm at it, we can't boast Supreme Court justices as our VIPs, much as we wish we could. But we do have teachers who are VIPs, and with us tonight are three other distinguished history teachers, each of them a past winner of the District of Columbia History Teacher of the Year Award. I'll name all three and ask them to stand together. The 2005 winner from Stuart Hobson Museum Middle School, Amy Trenkel. The 2007 winner from the Parkview Elementary School, Mary Jean Judd. And the 2008 winner from the Capital City Public Charter School, Cosby Hunt. Would you please stand and be recognized? To you and all the teachers in the room, I just want to say how grateful all of us are for the things that you do for the next generation. It is my privilege now to present the 2015 George Washington Book Prize to Nick Bunker for his remarkable book, An Empire on the Edge: How Britain Came to Fight America. Did the American Revolution begin in 1775 at Lexington and Concord? Or did it really begin 3 years earlier in Rhode Island, when several boatloads of local men attacked a British naval schooner, the Gaspé, shooting its captain and marooning its crew before blowing up the ship and sinking it? In those years, was the American colonial economy based on smuggling more than any other legitimate enterprise? What did the price of tea in Asia have to do with British domestic politics in the 1770s? If George III and Lord North both intensely disliked the East India Company, how did they come to wage war in support of its interests? Did the American Revolution really have to happen at all? These are the kinds of questions that arise from Nick Bunker's brilliant retelling of the 3 years that led up to the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775, placing the story of the American colonies in the larger context of the British Empire and its entanglement in what was already a complex, inextricably interconnected, and highly leveraged global economy. By birth and experience, Nick Bunker is the ideal man to write such a book. He is British, educated at King's College, Cambridge, and at Columbia University, which was indeed once called King's College as well. Mr. Bunker has had one career as a journalist and another as an investment banker. For several years, he wrote for the Liverpool Echo and then the Financial Times before becoming a banker, working chiefly with the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. During his years in finance and journalism, he traveled widely in China, India, in the former Soviet countries, and in the US, before settling into his third career as an historian. So financial analysis and global perspectives are deep in his makeup, but so is storytelling. And it is his genius as a storyteller that ultimately shines through in this book. Reviewers on both sides of the Atlantic have showered Empire on the Edge with terms like lively, fascinating, utterly absorbing, and enthralling, with one reviewer finding it, quote, replete with unexpected twists and turns, and another calling it a complex tale told with color and enthusiasm. No wonder it has already won this year the 2015 Francis Tavern Museum Award, Book Award, and as was mentioned, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And tonight, Empire on the Edge wins the 2015 George Washington Book Prize. On behalf of the board of the prize, I'm delighted to present Nick Bunker, not with a check, but being a banker, he trusts a wire more. So I have the foil of his $50,000 wire to his account back home, and our heartfelt congratulations.
Well, thank you very much indeed. As we were standing outside earlier on the lawn above the Potomac, with the shadows lengthening on the grass and the dusk gradually settling to the north around the District of Columbia, I was reminded of the proud boast that was made by my Victorian forebears in the British Isles, the boast that the sun never sets on the British Empire. To which a skeptical American replied, "Yes, but that's only because God doesn't trust an Englishman in the dark." Now, first of all, I'd like to just reiterate the words of thanks that I said outside. The thanks to the Ladies Association, to Barbara Lucas, to the sponsors of the prize, the judging panel, and to the other people I mentioned, to my editors at Knopf and Bodley Head, and also to my agent, Bill Hamilton, and to my wife, Sue. Now, in a moment, I'm going to talk a little bit about An Empire on the Edge, about how it came to be written, about the messages that it is intended to convey, and about the effect that I wanted to have upon the reader. But before I do that, I just want to refer to some recent events in the United Kingdom which have more than a passing relevance to the American Revolution. And as I'm sure you're aware, less than 2 weeks ago, on May the 7th, we in the United Kingdom went to the polls for a general election. It was the 8th general election in which I have cast a vote in the UK. And before you start indulging in mental arithmetic, I can spare you the trouble by telling you that makes me 56 years old. It was the 8th general election in which I've cast a vote, and in many ways the most remarkable. I never thought we'd see an election result actually as remarkable as the one in 1979, which brought about, of course, the Thatcher administration. But this one was extraordinary. North of the border, in Scotland, the Scottish National Party swept the board, taking 56 out of 59 seats. And that is an extraordinary electoral phenomenon in the history of Great Britain. In order to find something comparable, you have to go back nearly a century to 1918, when pretty much exactly the same thing happened in the 26 counties of Southern Ireland that now form the Irish Republic. But the result south of the border, in England and Wales, was also quite extraordinary, because it entirely confounded the pollsters. It had been generally expected that Labour and Conservative would run neck and neck right up to the final wire, and that there would be a hung parliament. In fact, that was incorrect. What actually happened was the Conservative Party achieved an overall majority, confounding all the predictions. Now, both of these events, what happened in Scotland and what happened south of the border, clearly have a relevance to our study of the American Revolution. First of all, we're now seeing in the United Kingdom, once again, independence movements emerging and challenging the sovereignty of the British Parliament, just as in America in the 1770s and in Ireland after the First World War. But it's really the other result, the result in England, that I'd like to just briefly allude to. You see, the fact that the pollsters and experts and politicians themselves found it so hard to call public opinion in the run-up to that election result is itself very illuminating. Despite all the technology of opinion polls and focus groups and social media and so on and so forth, they were dumbfounded by the result that actually occurred. Now, if that's true when we're talking about events in the present day, where we have lots and lots and lots of information at hand, how can historians claim to be able to gauge and to take the pulse of public opinion more than 200 years ago in the America and Great Britain of the 1770s? Now, very famously, John Adams said that the revolution that began at Lexington had been preceded by a revolution in the minds of the people. I'm paraphrasing, but that's roughly what he said. And that's clearly true. But from a historian's point of view, we need to do a little bit more than that. We need to be able to chart exactly how public opinion was moving in different colonies within what is now the United States, in Great Britain, from month to month, from year to year, in order to be able to chart the process by which the revolution unfolded. And that, of course, is extraordinarily difficult. It was also difficult for people at the time. The problem was that Lord North himself, the British Prime Minister, and his colleagues in the cabinet found it extraordinarily difficult to tell exactly what Americans were up to. Were the people who dumped in the tea in the harbour in Boston on December 16, 1773 simply racketeers trying to defend illegal trade? Or were they genuine revolutionaries trying to create a new political order? The Americans had the same problem when they looked across the Atlantic. They had to try and work out what the British government was really trying to achieve and what the British people thought about it. And this had fateful results too. In August 1774, a critical moment arrived when Samuel Adams and his colleagues in Massachusetts appear to have taken the view, based on reading the British newspapers, which is not necessarily the best source of accurate information, based on reading the newspapers, they formed the view that if they stood up to the British firmly, then a tidal wave of British public opinion in support of America would sweep Lord North and his colleagues from office. This was entirely false. So these issues of public opinion are absolutely vital to the story. And they were uppermost in my mind throughout the writing of An Empire on the Edge. I didn't actually intend to write this book. I actually intended to write a different book. I intended to write a narrowly focused work of narrative nonfiction dealing simply with the Tea Party, its immediate origins, and then cutting the story short fairly shortly afterwards. And I felt that was a feasible thing to do because no British author has ever written a book solely about the Boston Tea Party, strange as that may sound. And I thought there were archival sources that hadn't been sufficiently explored. The trouble was, I soon discovered that there is nothing simple or straightforward about the Boston Tea Party. And I'll just briefly allude to one particular aspect of it, which is the one that every historian comes up against, and that is the fact that we don't know the names of all the men who took part. The difficulty is that the Tea Party raiders, the men who dumped the tea in the water at Griffin's Wharf, maintained a kind of Cosa Nostra code of silence for at least 50 years, when a few men started to come forward. Now, there are two lists that survive from the period. One's called the Thatcher list from the mid-1830s, and it has 58 names on it. And the other one is the Drake list from the 1880s, which has 113 names. Now, the problem with the 58 name list is that it's too short. It checks out pretty well against the surviving sources from Boston, so the names on it are pretty accurate, probably, but it's too brief. The other list, the Drake list of 113 names, contains names and in many cases are entirely spurious. There's one particular interesting case, an imposter who turned up in Chicago in the 1850s claiming to have been taking part in the Boston Tea Party and claiming to be 116 years old. And believe it or not, I think there's actually still a monument to him in Chicago that says he was a survivor of the Boston Tea Party. But he appears on the Drake list. And one of the things I did in the research was I was trying as far as I could to identify who they were. And so I went to consult Mr. Drake's working papers in an archive in Boston and discovered that they were very, very, shall we say, to put it bluntly, they were lacking in rigor. But it's really important, this is an important point, because if we don't know the names of the people who took part in the Boston Tea Party, if we can't analyze what kind of backgrounds they have and where they came from and what they did next, then we obviously have a problem about determining what they really had in mind. Were they simply trying to stage a rerun, a very theatrical rerun of the Stamp Act process of the mid-1760s, that is to say, simply to refuse the implementation of a particular tax and then see everything go back to normal, so to speak? Or were they genuinely committing a revolutionary act in which they were repudiating British authority entirely? Now, this is a big question, but it's one that clearly is almost entirely unanswerable to the standards of evidence that might be required in a criminal court, for example, if we don't know the names of the people involved. So I decided the best thing to do, obviously I decided to reject the possibility of me handing my advance back to my publisher. I decided the best thing to do was to widen the scope of the inquiry and to create a broader book which would deal with the entire 3.5 to 4 year period before the war, including the destruction of the gas bay, to which Jim referred, which is an exceptionally interesting episode, and then taking the story up to the exact moment before the fighting started at Lexington, to the moment where Lord Dartmouth, the British Colonial Secretary, sent the dispatch that sent the Redcoats up the road towards Concord Bridge. My view being that if I broadened the scope of the inquiry, then some of the questions about public opinion to which I referred would kind of resolve themselves. Now, what kind of a book is An Empire on the Edge? Now, what I'd like to do here is just briefly, there's a lot in the book, just briefly to refer to the work of a famous philosopher who I'm sure many of you will have heard of and whose work you'll be familiar with. That is to say, Sir Isaiah Berlin, who in my youth and young manhood was a very, very important influence in intellectual life in Great Britain. Now, famously, Sir Isaiah Berlin wrote in the 1950s an essay called The Hedgehog and the Fox, which has been very, very widely read indeed. It was about Tolstoy, in fact. And it was based essentially on a few lines from a Greek poet to the effect that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And the point of this for Isaiah Berlin was that what he was trying to do was divide thinkers and artists into two categories. There are those who are hedgehogs, who try to express their view of the world in terms of a single overarching vision, a set of very, very simple fundamental principles by which they interpret everything they see. On the other hand, the foxes, who are much more interested in detail and variety and difference and nuance, who don't really see the need to bind everything into some kind of unified vision. And I think you can say that about historians too. Historians fall into the hedgehog category or the fox category. Now, Empire on the Edge, what kind of a book is that? Well, there are certainly some hedgehog elements in Empire on the Edge. It does have a kind of a central thesis, and that central thesis is this, that the fundamental problem with the British presence in North America was that they were effectively trying to run two empires. One of those empires was a formal, territorial, official empire. Flags on the map, men in red uniforms, coats of arms stuck up on the side of the State House in Boston or in public buildings in Virginia, a legal framework, an official, formal political empire. But they also had a commercial empire, a commercial empire built out of flows of cotton, well, not cotton at this stage, tobacco and indigo and rice and tea coming in from China, and of course encompassing the West Indies and the slave economy there as well. And the difficulty was that crises in these two empires coincided with each other. A crisis in the political empire, in terms of their relationships with the colonists, and a financial crisis in the commercial empire as well. And when these two crises came together, as they did in the case of the Gaspé incident and the Boston Tea Party, the British political system was simply incapable of managing the consequences. So that's kind of the thesis of the book. But I have to say that if I wanted to I would prefer readers to take away from the book something rather different. What I prefer them to take away from it is more of what I would call the fox elements of the book. That is to say, not so much a general thesis about what occurred, but more the rendering in my work of the texture events, the ebb and flow of opinion, and the subjective elements of history inside the heads of the participants. What I hope people will take away from the book, therefore, is what you might call the Virginia Woolf aspect of the book. Now, what I mean by that is simply this. If you want to read about the history of the First World War, the military history of World War I, you go to writers like Max Hastings, who will tell you very eloquently and also with an immense amount of insight about the dynamics of war on the Western Front. If, on the other hand, you want to know what the war, World War I, meant to the people who took part in it and the emotional havoc that it wreaked afterwards, you should go to Virginia Woolf, to Mrs. Dalloway, or to others of her novels. The First World War being a presence in all of her novels. And to be honest, I would prefer, frankly, if what people take away from An Empire on Edge is the Virginia Woolfian aspects of the book. And I'd just like to share with you a few of what I think are the things that I hope that people will take away, the episodes in the book that I would prefer people to remember. One of those is my account of the East India Company tea fleet. The East India Company tea fleet immured in a kind of claustrophobic semi-imprisonment in the estuary of the Pearl River in China, waiting out the typhoon season before they could return to England with the cargoes of tea. And this is a picture that is drawn in early in the book, and which I constructed out of the captain's logs of the East India Company's ships, all of which are available on file in the British Library, but none of which probably have been read between the time when they were originally produced in the 1770s and the time when I looked at them in 2009, 2010. A second part of the book, which I hope people will take away, is my account of an American politician, a very interesting American politician, a future vice president, a man, unfortunately, whose name has gone down in history for gerrymandering. I'm talking about Elbridge Gerry, a politician from Marblehead, Massachusetts. What I did there was that I unearthed Gerry's letters and correspondence from the Bancroft collection in the New York Public Library. what I tried to do was to show how a full year before Lexington, this very interesting, very intense young politician from Massachusetts was already working himself up rhetorically towards advocating an armed struggle against Great Britain. So that's another episode in the book that I hope people will take away. The third one is my account of what went on inside the head of Lord Dartmouth. Lord Dartmouth was the colonial secretary. Lord Dartmouth was Lord North's right-hand man. And it fell to Lord Dartmouth, William Legge, second Earl of Dartmouth, to give him his proper name, to write the fatal dispatch on January the 27th, 1775, that told General Gage in Boston to get tough with the rebels and march up the road. Now, the point of the matter is that Dartmouth was a very conflicted individual. He was a very, very sincere evangelical Christian at a time when that was very rare in the British aristocracy. He was a Calvinist. He was a man torn between the injunction of benevolence on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Calvinist insistence that depraved people must be punished in one way or another. And that, again, is an important part of the book. Here, what I did was to use the 35 or so letters between Lord Dartmouth and his son, which survive in the Staffordshire Record Office in Stafford in London, in England, with a view to constructing, if you like, a picture of his internal life. But finally, the one final example I'll give of something that I hope that people remember from the book has to do with perhaps my favourite character in the entire volume. And that is somebody who is not at all famous. She's a woman, and there are very few female characters in the book. She's not at all famous, but nevertheless she's my favourite character in the entire book, An Empire on the Edge. Her name was Lady Mary Cook. She was born in 1727, died in 1811. She's only really known to historians and scholars at all because she was a great friend of the diarist and aesthete Horace Walpole. Very great friend. I mean, the two of them, to be honest, were a kind of 18th century version of Will and Grace. And what she did, which was so useful from my point of view, was that she wrote a wonderful journal of her own, a very gossipy private journal about life at the court of King George III. And it's incredibly useful to a historian because she wasn't a political animal. Most of the time, she wrote gossip and anecdotes and stories about her card games with Princess Amelia, the aunt of George III. Princess Amelia always used to win. Lady Mary used to lose 20 guineas at a time, and she was continually going to her banker to get drafts for extra money and so on and so forth. So she wasn't very interested in politics. So the times when she does talk about politics, the times when politics enters her writing are all the more interesting for that very reason. And towards the end of 1774, the American Revolution suddenly surfaces in the journal of Lady Mary Cook. Now, what happened was this. The autumn of 1774 in Great Britain was very wet and very cold, unusually wet and cold, even by British standards. And the winter set in very early. Now, she was a very keen amateur gardener. She had a little house in Notting Hill, she had a place by the Thames. She was a very keen amateur gardener. And so her diary records her despair at seeing the havoc that was wreaked on her horticulture by these very inclement weather conditions. But then also she begins to write about the American Revolution. And she writes this on December the 7th, 1774. Now the date is important, December the 7th, 1774, because of course this is 4 months before the shots ring out of Lexington and 5 months, or nearly 6 months, before the full reports of that arrive in England. Listen to what she says. "'Tis believed that there has actually been an engagement in America. I pity those who have relations in that part of the world where there is beginning a civil war." So in other words, 4 months before the fighting started, 5 months before the news arrived, at the court of King George III, well-placed sources such as Lady Mary Cook were already convinced that a war had started. Now, you can see from a historian's point of view why this is so important. If that's the case, if at the very highest echelons of British society they already thought the fighting had begun, not least because they read reports in the newspapers to that effect, then it's hardly surprising that Lord Dartmouth sent the orders that he did, because talk of this kind becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. But it's also, I think, important to register the tone and the melancholy with which she writes. And that's where I'd like to leave you, with this society lady sitting in her little house somewhere on the western outskirts of London, looking out over her frozen flower beds and writing this entry in her diary as she contemplates with somber foreboding the onset of a war that would cost the lives of at least 20,000 English, Scottish, and Irish servicemen and a significantly greater number of Americans. Thank you very much.
And now for the best part. If I could get the president of Mount Vernon to sit down. It's now my honor to conclude the evening by saying that our important mission here at Mount Vernon relies first on exceptional and timely scholarship, not only about the father of our country, but the historical and social context in which he fought for his nation, built his home, and founded enduring presidential precedents. And so, speaking of precedents, I'm going to talk about a fitting 18th century end to tonight's festivities with a customary huzzah. So tonight we commemorate the 11th annual George Washington Book Prize. We salute the finalists. We salute the 2015 medal winner, and it's only fitting as we gather so many who dedicated their careers to the study of the founding of this great country that we salute with a toast the man without whom none of this would be possible. This is an audience who knows very well the tradition of Mount Vernon's closing of events with the hearty huzzah of the 18th century, so I won't give you all the rules. You'll figure it out. George Washington lived a life of purpose. His leadership and character are second to none. His accomplishments inspired those of his day, and they inspire us today. His values provide a timeless guide for what is important. He saw life's highest heights, and he experienced its deepest valleys. But he always demonstrated a respect for civility and a zeal for lifelong learning. So let us raise our glasses in tribute to a man for all seasons, the father of our country, George Washington. Hip, hip, huzzah! Hip, hip, huzzah! Hip, hip, huzzah! George Washington, thank you all for coming. I hope to see you next year, and we're always thrilled to have you. Thanks.